22 billion CFA francs every single year, leaving Burkina Faso. And when I first saw that number, I honestly could not believe it. Not through war, not through sanctions, not through the kind of dramatic economic violence that makes international headlines and triggers emergency summits in Geneva and Brussels. Through milk, powdered milk, imported milk, foreign milk shipped into a country that has over 70 million livestock animals grazing on its soil and still cannot do one, feed its own children dairy products without writing a check to European corporations every single morning. I need you to sit with that for a moment. 22 billion CFA francs, 29 million US dollars, leaving Burkina Faso every year, quietly, structurally, by design, and nobody in the international development community calls it what it is. Nobody raises an alarm. Nobody at the World Food Programme convenes an emergency session about a country hemorrhaging nearly $30 million a year on a product that its own land, its own animals, and its own people should be producing right at home. Because this is not a crisis that anyone with an interest in keeping Burkina Faso dependent wants solved. But then, in March 2026, something lands at the port of Lomé in Togo that changes everything. 710 pregnant cows shipped across the Atlantic Ocean from Brazil, carrying inside them not just calves, but the genetic future of Burkinabe dairy, sovereignty. And the man who ordered them is not a development economist with a PhD from some European university. He is a soldier, a captain, a military leader who looked at 22 billion CFA francs walking out of his country every year and said, enough, this ends now. This is that story, and I promise you, by the time we are done, you will never look at a glass of milk the same way again. Now, before we get into the cows, and trust me, we are absolutely getting into the cows, you need to understand the problem that made all of this necessary. Because here is the thing that shocked me most when I started researching this story. Burkina Faso is not a country without animals. With over 70 million total livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, camels, poultry. It has one of the largest animal populations in West Africa relative to its size. The cattle sector alone makes up roughly 14% of that enormous number. On paper, this should be a country swimming in dairy products, a country whose rural communities have lived alongside cattle for generations, a country where the relationship between people and their animals is not just economic but deeply cultural, woven into the fabric of who they are. And yet, 25,000 tons of dairy imported every single year. How does that happen? The answer is standing in those fields right now, grazing slowly, walking long distances between water sources, surviving on minimal food and sparse vegetation with a toughness that honestly deserves its own documentary. The local Zebu cattle breeds of the Sahel are genetic marvels of survival. They are built for harsh, dry, punishing conditions in ways no imported European breed could ever survive. They tolerate extreme heat, they resist local parasites and diseases that would wipe out foreign cattle within weeks. But, and this is the part that stopped me cold, they produce barely any milk. A healthy local Zebu cow gives between half a liter and 1.3 liters of milk per day, not per hour, per day. Meanwhile, a high-performing European dairy cow produces between 25 and 40 liters daily. I mean, that gap is not just significant, that gap is the entire problem. And closing it is not something you can do with better feeding or improved grazing management. This is a genetic gap, and genetic gaps require genetic solutions. Previous governments knew this. Development reports documented it for decades. International organizations wrote papers, held conferences, recommended interventions, and those interventions always involved more foreign technical assistance, more imported inputs, more dependency on the very systems creating the problem in the first place. Captain Traoré reads those reports and then does something nobody expected. The decision comes from inside the Ministry of Agriculture and Animal Resources, and I want you to pay attention to what happens next, because this is where the story gets really interesting. The direction is clear and unapologetic. Burkina Faso is not going to slowly improve its cattle genetics through programs that take 20 years and require permanent foreign supervision. It is going to source elite genetic stock from the best tropical dairy producers on earth and bring that stock directly to Burkinabe soil. Simple, direct, sovereign. Now, the obvious answer, if you follow conventional development logic, is Europe. European dairy breeds produce extraordinary milk volumes. Holstein cows are among the most productive milk animals ever developed by human breeding. But here is what the conventional development experts conveniently forget to mention. Holsteins are built for European climates. Take a pure Holstein to the Sahel, and within months it starts deteriorating. The heat stress alone crushes milk production. The local parasites attack animals whose immune systems have zero evolutionary preparation for them. You end up with expensive imported cattle performing far below their genetic potential, requiring constant costly intervention just to stay alive. This is the trap that previous African agricultural programs fell into over and over again. Import European animals, watch them struggle, blame African agricultural capacity instead of the obvious mismatch, recommend more foreign experts. Repeat forever. I have seen this pattern so many times, it is almost painful to watch. Captain Traore's team rejects the trap completely. They look south, all the way across the Atlantic, to a country that spent decades solving exactly this problem for itself, and nobody in the African development conversation seems to talk about it. Brazil. Now, when I first read that Burkina Faso was going to Brazil for dairy cattle, I genuinely stopped and read the sentence again, because that is not the kind of decision you see coming. But the more I dug into it, the more it made complete and total sense. Brazil spent generations developing tropical dairy genetics, faced with the same fundamental challenge. How do you produce commercial milk volumes in hot, humid, parasite-rich tropical conditions? Brazilian agricultural scientists built something extraordinary. The Gerolando breed, 5/8 Holstein for milk volume, 3/8 jar, a hardy, heat-tolerant zebu breed originally from South Asia for survival capacity. The result is an animal that produces between 15 and 40 liters of milk per day, that tolerates tropical heat that would flatten a pure Holstein, that resists the parasites and diseases of tropical environments, that has the physical durability for African terrain. It is, and I do not say this lightly, exactly what the Sahel has been waiting for. In June 2025, the government moves. CPMEP, Burkina Faso's Center for the Promotion of Poultry Farming and the Multiplication of High-Performing Animals, finalizes a landmark deal with the Daniel Franco Institute in Brazil. And then the government does something that tells you everything about how seriously it is taking this. It subsidizes 2 million CFA francs per animal to make sure local farmers can actually access these cattle. 2 million per animal out of the state budget, because what is the point of sourcing the best dairy genetics in the world if the farmers who need them cannot afford to participate? That is not the thinking of a government playing politics with agriculture. That is the thinking of a government that genuinely intends to solve a problem. Now, getting 710 pregnant cows from Brazil to a landlocked country in the middle of West Africa. I have to be honest with you. When I understood the full logistics of what this required, my jaw dropped a little. Living livestock cannot be shipped like grain. Pregnant living livestock require continuous veterinary oversight, controlled environmental eating conditions, adequate space, consistent nutrition, and stress management throughout a weeks-long ocean crossing. One serious failure in that chain, and you lose animals before they ever reach their destination. Specialized livestock carrier vessels handle the ocean crossing. But the challenge does not end when the ships dock, because Burkina Faso has no coastline. There is no port. The nearest viable deep water port capable of handling a livestock carrier is the port of Lomé in Togo, a neighboring coastal nation connected to Burkina Faso by overland corridors crossing significant West African distances. So the cows land in Lomé, transfer into secure, well-ventilated cattle trucks, drive north through the Togolese transport corridor, cross the border into Burkina Faso, continue to Lumbila Livestock Station just outside Ouagadougou. At every single stage of that journey, the health, stress levels, hydration, and nutritional status of 710 pregnant animals must be actively managed. A stressed pregnant cow is a cow whose pregnancy is at risk, and a lost pregnancy is a lost future herd. The convoy arrives at Lumbila in March 2026. Minister of State for Agriculture Ismael Sombier is personally there. He inspects sanitary conditions himself. He oversees distribution to pre-vetted local breeders. And then the numbers start arriving. 710 pregnant Girolando cows, each producing 15 to 40 liters daily. Agricultural planners project 1.2 million liters of new domestic milk supply in the first production cycle alone. I want you to compare that to something. 710 local Zebu cows at 1 liter per day produce 710 liters daily. The same number of Girolando cows produce a minimum of 10,650 liters on that same day. I read that comparison 3 times before it fully landed. That is not an improvement. That is a completely different reality. That is not an improvement. That is a completely different reality. But here is the part of this story that most people miss entirely. And honestly, this is the part that made me realize just how deeply this government has thought through what it is building. The cows are not the complete story. They are the raw material input for something larger, something that connects the genetic revolution happening in the fields to an economic revolution happening in the processing plants. Its name is Faso Kosam, Burkina Faso's new state-owned dairy enterprise launched specifically to receive, process, and distribute the dramatically increased milk volumes the Brazilian program generates. See, the trap that has kept African dairy sectors permanently weak is not just about cow genetics, it is about what happens after the milk comes out. European companies have spent decades buying raw materials from African producers at suppressed prices, then shipping back finished products like condensed milk and milk powder at prices African domestic producers simply cannot compete with. Why can they not compete? Because they lack the processing infrastructure to turn raw fluid milk into shelf-stable products. Without that infrastructure, raw milk spoils before it reaches urban markets. Without urban market access, there is no economic incentive to improve production. The sector stays small, informal, and permanently vulnerable. Faso Kosam breaks that cycle at its root. Local farmers now have a guaranteed buyer. The state enterprise purchases raw milk directly from the network of local breeders. Faso Kosam processes it into exactly the condensed milk and milk powder that Burkina Faso has been importing from Europe. The loop closes completely. Farmers get income, the factory gets volume, the market gets domestic products, and 22 billion CFA francs stays inside Burkina Faso. When I understood this fully, the cows plus the processing plant plus the guaranteed buyer network, I realized this is not an agricultural program. This is a sovereign economic architecture. The 2030 vision behind all of this is specific and measurable. By scaling up through direct herd expansion, artificial insemination, and embryo transfer programs, multiplying the Girolando genetics across Burkina Faso's existing cattle population, the government projects covering at least 50% of domestic dairy needs within the next few years. 50% of 25,000 tons of annual demand produced domestically, processed domestically, sold domestically. The 11 to 12 billion CFA francs that represents kept home instead of sent abroad funds schools, it funds infrastructure, it funds rural jobs, it funds the next generation of agricultural investment without a single foreign donor, without a single development loan with conditions attached. And beyond the domestic market, the vision goes further. An industrialized Burkinabe dairy sector positioned to export finished products across the Sahel and West Africa. Markets where demand for quality dairy consistently outpaces local supply in nearly every neighboring country. The country that was importing 25,000 tons annually could within a decade be exporting to its neighbors. All of that embedded in 710 pregnant cows from Brazil. I want to leave you with something simple. The trucks that rolled into Lumbila in March 2026 did not make international headlines. No major Western outlet covered the story. No emergency press conference was called. No development organization issued a statement praising the initiative. It arrived quietly, the way real change usually does. But those 710 pregnant cows carrying Brazilian genetics onto Burkinabe soil represent something that cannot be overstated. They represent a government that looked at a structural problem draining 22 billion CFA francs annually from its people, and instead of commissioning another report, applying for another grant, or accepting another foreign technical assistance program designed to keep the dependency intact, went and found the actual solution in Brazil, of all places. Captain Traoré did not ask permission for this. He did not wait for an international agricultural conference to validate the idea. He identified the problem, found the best answer available on earth, subsidized access so ordinary Burkinabe farmers could participate, and built the processing infrastructure to turn increased production into retained national wealth. That is what sovereignty looks like when it stops being a speech and becomes a policy. Burkina Faso's children will drink local milk. Burkinabe farmers will earn fair incomes from animals their government invested in giving them. Faso Kosam will fill the shelves that European powdered milk used to own, and 22 billion CFA francs will stay home. I could not believe this story when I first found it. Now I cannot stop telling it. Asterisk, like this video, subscribe to the Sohar Bulletin, share this with every person who needs to understand that food sovereignty is not a speech, it is a pregnant cow from Brazil arriving at Lumbila in March 2026. We will be here every step of the way.